Um, I would like to welcome everyone in the room and virtual audience to one of the KnowTalks sessions held today. KnowTalks constitute a joint initiative between the United Nations Development Program in collaboration with the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Knowledge Foundation. And this special edition is being held as part of a special series of talks known as the KnowTalks, held live from the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. These sessions have started on the 23rd of May and will be extended until the 29th of May. Every day from 12 noon until 1 in the afternoon. I would like to extend the gratitude and the thanks to the Knowledge Foundation. I'm really honored and happy to host one of the keynote speakers was visiting us today, talking about a very, very important topic. Before we proceed with the introduction and the details of the topic, I would like to just alert the audience, especially those joining us live from Zoom, that there is interpretation and translation provided under the bottom of the screen. في ترجمة متوفرة للمتحدثين بلغة أخرى غير اللغة الإنجليزية والترجمة متوفرة بأكثر من لغة. At the same time, I would like to also alert the audience that there is a questions and answers box at the bottom of the screen as well. So please feel free to participate with your inquiries and questions through the chat box. And one of our admins will be filtering these questions and sharing them with me so that I voice them out on your behalf. Without further ado, I would like to announce the title of this session, which is Unlocking the Potential of Human Progress Through Geospatial Data. I'm very happy to meet for the first time and to host and moderate this session with Mr. Ali Al Sammarraie. A long introduction is entitled here. Mr. Ali is an urban planner, urban scientist, and an architect by training. He focuses on the urban integration for Ittihad Rail's vision, including passenger rail and high-speed rail. He is also part of a team at Harvard University leading the research on using future mobility trends to transform the streetscape carbon footprints. His experience spans from urban design all the way to master planning, to mobility and strategy, asset management, and analytics. Mr. Ali has received his master's degree in city planning from MIT, Harvard, and his bachelor's degree in architecture from the American University in Sharjah. Ali works with the World Bank as well on building mobility and urban framework of indicators for major cities in Southeast Asia, and has experience in North America, Asia in general, and of course, the MENA region. I'm really honored and pleased to have you with me, Ali, and I want to just break the ice between us and between the audience as well, and to give you the floor and asking you one of these simple introductory questions. What is geospatial data? What are the types that come underneath this title, which sounds rather complicated, and give us more insights about how we use it, whether from the government perspective or the private sector or individual perspective. Thank you.
Well, thanks. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Mona, and everyone here for arranging this exciting topic. It's really a thrill to be in this part of conversation in this part of the world, talking about issues that are really at the forefront right now in planning, in asset management, in different aspects of our lives. Just to sort of the icebreaker point to talk about what geospatial planning is and sort of to try to break it in common terms. Really what geospatial data is, it's really like if you work in Excel and you build a graph, a chart about the progression of fatalities in a city against the time, or the fatalities against the race, or the fatalities against the age group, you get an X and Y axis. A geospatial data adds a third component to that, which it takes, can you hear me okay? Great. So I'll repeat briefly what geospatial data is. It's in essence, it's an Excel sheet where you plot on the x-axis, you plot a variable, and on the y-axis a different variable, but with the addition of showing where that happens across space. And a good example here, I thought that was very relevant to this conversation, was the New York Times plot of COVID deaths in the United States against where it's happening. And that's what's animated in this slide, where you see the deaths that are happening across time, in the United States, and then it breaks it down into areas where the death series happen. I think that is the power that's not easily revealed in a linear data type, a spatial versus a linear data type.
So it adds the third dimension.
Right, and there is a new variable, which we can talk about later, which is, adding the time series, a fourth dimension. What that will unlock is the ability to predict for the future, the ability to create a 95% confidence interval, and as to how much deaths am I going to get in the next year or 6 months. That's the fourth dimension that we can add to spatial data, in addition to where it's going to happen. So that's sort of in a nutshell what geospatial data is. It sounds complicated, but it isn't. It's just understanding that it's adding yet another simple variable that shows where the Excel sheet happens in space.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. So for me to capitalize on the benefits of such scope, what are the requirements that need to be present and available, whether in terms of data, databases, data inputting or insertion of data? What exactly is required as prerequisites to engage and capitalize on the benefits of geospatial data?
Yeah, on the benefits, I want to touch on that a bit later and talk about the applications of geospatial data. But to your first point, in geospatial analysis, in any analysis for that matter, your output is only as good as the input. So a big chunk for sort of urban scientists and data scientists and statisticians for that matter, the biggest challenge is to get accurate, clean, and well-prepared data sets.
That's the keyword, accurate.
Otherwise, there is an acronym which is GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out. And we want to avoid inputting garbage to put a lot of processing and analysis into, because the end result is not going to serve our work justice. So in my mind, it's like, there is a saying, we say, understanding the question is half the answer. In the case of geospatial analytics, that question is the clean data.
Absolutely clear. Okay, so this basically crystallizes the idea that I initially had in mind. It's all about the availability of data and the use of this data, and how do I utilize information to come out with the best results, whether in terms of decision-making or forecasting the future and predicting certain trends according to the industry that I'm working for or working in. All right, so this takes me to another question. If I were to utilize geospatial data from the perspective of public policies and government decision-making, how would you go about to demonstrate how these are effective and highly impacted by geospatial data? And I believe you've prepared some interesting slides and examples to manifest or to demonstrate.
Yeah, so in terms of policy, so geospatial data has uses across the field. So it's not only exclusive to policy, it's also included in budget allocations. It's included in urban and sustainable development. So if we're talking about the 2030 goals, there is sustainable and urban development, clean water. It's utilized, and we can talk about these examples. I'll just let the conversation flow based on what the audience is talking about. So there is if we think about mobility, COVID response, if we think about policy, it's a case example for COVID, for geospatial applications is in this slide. This was some of the work we've done, which can be applicable to any city in any part of the world, in budget allocations in Washington, D.C. So while it was Washington, D.C., we talked about, this is the amount of money that the city gets. What is the best way? Let's talk, for example, in the layer of schools. What is the best example? From an equitable standpoint, we want everyone to get a good quality education, and that's in line with the goals not only of the UAE, but in the goals of the 2030 plans. If we want everyone to get good quality education and equitable access to education, not equal, because geospatially, not every place is the same.
But at least to guarantee the accessibility.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So what geospatial allows you is to understand where areas are getting less amount of quality learning, and what you can identify is how can I support that with resources, whether it's teachers, whether it's financial resources, whether it's reconstruction and renovation of the school system in that area. That's one policy implication of understanding geospatial data. Another example is crimes. The States is very well known for tackling crimes through geospatial data. DC and Baltimore actually per capita is the highest crime rate in the United States. So what they do is they identify where the highest rate of crime rate happens and what can we do in terms of education programs, in terms of security programs, in terms of surveillance, social equity, security. These are all indicators that we'll use to test back and give us feedback to how well was our solution to these areas. But the key is, this is only revealed and unlocked if we understand it in a geospatial manner.
Okay, really interesting. I was having a conversation with an acquaintance of mine, and when I was discussing geospatial data and the details that pertain to that term, so it caught my attention, an interesting expression, which is the power of where. So geospatial data is associated with this clause, the power of where. So I would like to ask you, under the umbrella of the power that comes with the where, how do we realize the potential of geospatial data in terms of policy making? And you've given some examples of that, especially that recently it came to my knowledge while I was doing some research in preparation for this session that a case, for example, in India, if we're going to be addressing this topic from a global perspective, a case in India where they've announced granting accessibility to the private sector entities to some of the databases that feed into geospatial data with the main objective of allowing for better planning and management of resources. So what can you or how can you comment on this?
I mean, I'm all for publicizing data. Open sourcing data to the public will only improve the outcomes that we yield from a planning perspective, from a policy perspective. You mentioned India, right? So I'm just going to share really quickly the slide. What you see on the right-hand side is a project in India. And what we tackled into there is the specific topic of accessibility that you mentioned. There are different layers that we attacked here. For example, accessibility for women, safety of women. We know gender violence is a prevalent issue in Southeast Asia, in India specifically. And in Tamil Nadu, to be more specific, there is a high crime rate. And understanding where that happens will allow us to think about strategic ways to give women access to jobs, to mobility. And that's one example of where we utilize mobility schedules, public transit schedules to cater for women's needs and minorities' needs. That's one example. Another example is thinking of sort of an urban form topic, which is access not only to jobs or accessibility for women, but access to the 30-minute city idea. What makes a 30-minute city? It's actually a service area analysis. It's a machine learning algorithm, supervised machine learning, asking the computer to tell us, actually in 15 minutes, I need to access the 7 crucial amenities that make an independent neighborhood that would not require any external resources for its survival. We have these 7 uses. We plot a 15-minute or 30-minute extent using the infrastructure of the city. We will identify the boundaries of that city. That's one application of it.
Can you give us some insights to the 7 main
yes.
uses or resources?
For example, we're in Abu Dhabi right now. So let's say we're in this neighborhood. It's a very famously known to have embassies, right? If I was in a residential neighborhood, I would like to have what makes an independent 30-minute city is a 30-minute access to amenities, including police station, safety and security, healthcare, hospitals, department stores, education centers for my kids to go to
pharmacies,
school.
maybe?
Pharmacy, it's part of healthcare and hospitals. So all of these are the basic amenities that are needed for our survival as a community.
It's clear now.
Once we identify those 7, if they all are available within a 30-minute radius, not a circle, the radius is called a service area, a service area radius. If it's available there, that makes an independent 30-minute city.
That's really interesting. Okay. Touching base again with the fact that accessibility of geospatial data and the information that comes along with it and the databases is given to the private sector. And basically, in simple English, we're trying to give access to information and open data and big data as well, between brackets, to other stakeholders besides the government. So how can you predict the future when it comes to giving such important information and valuable information to other stakeholders outside the government and state domain, and allowing also for some sort of participation in decision-making from other stakeholders besides the state, such as the private sector, maybe, for example, civil society entities? How do you see that coming?
Well, there are a few forces at play here. I think it's a great asset to publicize and get the private sector involved. Public-private partnership is essential to healthy growth of every metropolitan area. There are a few layers here. For example, let's take the example of real estate. If I get access to the real estate data and I'm interested as a public-private entity to invest
as a developer, for example.
As a developer, I want to gain benefit of developing in an area. So if I have spatial and understanding of that area in terms of what's the urban form, what's the building density there, what's the supply there, what's the demand there, what's the population there, I will project. We know if we have that data over time, we can project the likelihood of the demand over the next 10-year period, which is a standard. We normally 10-year period is a standard.
And I believe, I'm just adding, correct me if I'm wrong. So it's not only forecasting demand, it's also forecasting the nature of the demand and the segment or the market segment that will be interested in what I have to offer as a developer in real estate.
You're precisely right. You're precisely right. You can tweak it so your target audience is exactly who you want to be interested in buying this. For example, in the States, we were very keen and from a social equity perspective to provide housing for the bottom quintile. So we bisect the data, we bisect the geospatial data to understand where this demographic exists and what are their needs and how can we provide to them that need whilst they're benefiting from this service. Also, the city benefits from their service. So in the end, you get the people that are benefiting, you get the city that's benefiting because there is upcoming development, there is upcoming demand on the metropolitan area, and it becomes more of and the city benefits from, in the case of the States, there's taxes that go back to the city, and then that gets reinvested back into the public fund. So it's a circular loop, comes back and forth.
As an economist, I'm an economist. So as an economist, this translates to me as everyone goes home happy, resources are better utilized and employed, and beneficiaries, between brackets, the well-being of society is addressed. And the private sector is also employed in the best possible manner to employ the resources according to the social welfare standards. Okay, so you've given us some insightful examples about the applications of geospatial data in the fields of real estate. You've also touched base with the example that you referred to in India and security domain. What about relating the uses of geospatial data? I know you've mentioned it before, but let's touch base again or shed light to this aspect, to the link between geospatial data and the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. What about, for example, one of the keywords that you've mentioned in the introduction, which I used also in my introduction, was mobility. What exactly do you mean by mobility, and how can we relate it to the SDGs?
Actually, my mind was going a little bit somewhere where it's more relevant here, but I think mobility is even more relevant. So let's talk about mobility. Currently, what's being developed using geospatial data across the world, which can be, I see a very huge relevance to our city here in the United Arab Emirates, is the work we're doing with Toyota, which was looking at the future mobility trends. And by virtue of technology, we unlock new spaces of the streetscape, and how can we use those for carbon sequestration? I think that the emergency crisis is currently, the economy is important, mobility is important, public safety is important, public health is important, of course, but also climate emergency is at the forefront. And I think that in terms of mobility, that essence there of sort of the introduction of level 5 AVs. Level 5 AVs are the autonomous vehicles that do not require a driver for all intents and purposes. They're vestibules that take you from origin to destination without you having to get into the driver's seat. Once the city becomes fully autonomous, which is, in my opinion, it's bound to happen, it's just a matter of when, the streetscape is going to change for several reasons. It includes one, the machines are less prone to error. We just really crucify them a lot when they make a mistake because, you know, there's not a man behind the wheel to hold the blame to. We hold the machine and by extension, the company. Right. So there is less chances of error. They're more efficient in driving. There is no aggression in driving. What that yields into more efficient vehicular network. So immediately, all of a sudden, you don't really need a six-lane highway. You just need 3. So what do you do with about 200-kilometer long highway by 15 meters wide? That's just a long stretch of land. And this is the work we're developing with the Climate Change Solutions Fund. We're proposing that use that for linear urban forests. Create a local plant palette that will sequester the carbon of the city. And by extension, you're going to clean the air of the city, 1. And 2, you're going to contribute to the global climate crisis. And there are several issues of security. It creates a spatial buffer, so less car accidents. It protects the community, residential communities from the noise pollution that you get from highways. So there are many other added benefits. It contributes to the ecosystem. So if we think from a landscape architecture perspective, the systems of ecology, they get, you know, the birds, they will start to come and occupy
the ecosystem in general.
Right. And then that will trigger developments around these, if you call them sort of chains of emerald necklaces. Emerald necklace is a concept in planning that is famous in Boston and Chicago, where you get a necklace of trails, green sort of forest that encircles the city and has developments growing around it. So imagine the streets build a new manifestation of that emerald necklace, and it's possible with the emerging technologies of mobility.
This is amazing, and it is complicated, by the way, but it's amazing, and it's highly relevant because it addresses the scope of more than one industry, as you mentioned earlier as well. So we've delved into the transport industry, we've delved into real estate, we've given some examples to climate change issues, and we've given also examples related to the mobility of individuals and citizens in general. What about, for example, when I was also preparing for this session, I came across the blue economy in particular, benefiting from geospatial data. Can you comment on that?
It's a very fascinating topic, and unfortunately, at least based on my experience, there is not enough investment in the blue economy when it comes to geospatial data. But I see great potential in understanding the marine waterways where trades happen, and then how do we activate spaces that are around. If you know, there is well, let's give a local reference. We know Hudayriyat Island. It's just off of Abu Dhabi. It's between the main island of Abu Dhabi where we are, and just across the water channel, there's a Hudayriyat Island. We know there is a mangrove in between. There is some sort of water activities happening there. So that's a node. We already have a node. What we don't have is a platform to activate that node. I know there are efforts in planning that are being undertaken. And when I was in my previous role before joining Etihad Rail, I was at Jacobs doing just that. Understanding how we can activate the blue economy in the Abu Dhabi area. How do we activate the waterfront?
One of the items on the UAE agenda.
Yes, how we make the waterfront accessible. Fun fact, only 3% of the waterfront in Abu Dhabi is publicly accessible. So these are planning issues. These are not some of them might be for sort of political reasons, but most of it isn't. Most of it is a planning issue. The problem we have is similar to that of Manhattan, except Manhattan dealt with it. Manhattan introduced 2 highways, which we call similar highways, Al Khalij Al Arabi and Murur Street, which basically sandwiched the island away from the water.
Okay.
So what Manhattan did is it stitched back the water into the public domain. by sort of breaking down that highway. It's more difficult here for obvious reasons. We rely on long distance commute. The climate is different here. The socioeconomic sort of climate
Fabric.
It's vastly different. So the way we approach this should be vastly different.
But there's no denying that the commercial and economic benefits are there to be utilized or extracted from such application.
I would argue there is also great mental benefit, health benefit to having always being connected to nature, not visually, but also physically.
Absolutely. Okay. I don't want to get carried away, and I would like to take a couple of questions that I received from our online attendees. But before I do so, just in case there are other questions from the physical audience, if not, I will proceed immediately to the questions I've received from our online attendees. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. First question that I've received: how did the past couple of years impact the trends of urbanization in general?
That's an amazing question.
Yes.
I was thinking about that actually.
That's an extended essay question.
So it depends on what. So can you repeat that? Because I want to formulate that the right way.
Okay, word for word, step by step, because it actually intrigued me as well. How did the past couple of years impact the trends of urbanization in general?
So in the United States, let's start there, and then
Okay.
we'll come to the UAE and
Okay.
talk about other examples if we want. In the United States, with the impact of COVID, remote working became the norm.
Lovely.
So there was an impact of urban sprawl. People do not need all of a sudden to travel to the central business district. They do not need to go to downtown Chicago to the office. Instead, they work out of their suburb. So the real estate market actually boomed, especially housing in the United States. In contrast, the central business district, the downtown area, suffered a bit because some of them got leases that continued for the next year. Some of them had to terminate their lease because it does not make a business viability, and they reinvested that into the welfare of the employees.
Yeah, so the overhead expenses were diverted elsewhere. Yeah.
They diverted to the people who ended up buying more homes that are more suburban, that are more sprawled. So the general sort of impact in the West, at least in North America, was urban sprawl. In the UAE, it's more tricky because the trends were not consistent. There are some companies that are affiliated with their headquarters in the United States. They had to follow the mandate and do remote working, and by extension, people felt more comfortable with less commute. But a lot of the functions of the city require commute to the central business district. So I would say here it did not get impacted as severely as it did in terms of the sprawl and sort of the urban growth of the center.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that thorough answer. I did say it's an extended essay question. Okay, a couple of questions that I kind of, I can group them. One says, can future scenarios be built based on geospatial data? And the similar question says, how will the future of geospatial data unfold?
Wow. It's a very scary subject. And as a person who spends most of my time working with geospatial data and machine learning, my fear is the singularity. For anyone who may be familiar with sort of urban science or data science, the singularity is when really the computer, where an artificial intelligence starts to be making its own decisions, and it realizes does not lead instructions. But there are things like Isaac Asimov's rules for machines that we can code into the future trends of geospatial analysis that would protect, that would ensure that the decisions are controlled by the creator, which is a human. That is where my fear, I'm jumping maybe 50 years into the future, maybe less. But it's inevitable that machine learning and artificial intelligence will be a key driver in helping us predicting for the future. We already do it. We do it maybe a little bit more conservatively, but in the future, it's going to be a very tricky subject that would require a lot of attention.
Thank you for that, actually, because I was about to ask you, and also based on one of the questions that we received, when you were saying the word machine learning, I think it goes hand in hand with AI and artificial intelligence, that is. And there was a question that came from the audience: what is the relationship between geospatial data and artificial intelligence? And I believe you've covered that. But if you would like to give another comment, please do.
Well, I can speak about a machine learning example I've done in the past years, where we were working on a project. We looked at satellite imagery, but we needed to extract, well, it was in America. So in America, the roofscape of buildings are usually sloped because it rains there.
Yes.
We have a different morphology here. So there was no data of that slope. So what we did is we trained through supervised machine learning, we trained an algorithm to detect the slopes and identify their curvature or their angle. And we kept doing that until the margin of error got so slim that they only make 5%, give or take, sort of error in determining the slope. And then once we're confident with that, we let the ML algorithm run and it detects the entire city. And by the end, we get the entire roofscape of the city in America that we're working with. AI would take that without, of course, under my instruction, they would take that and they would make new types of information that are different than just finding the slopes of the roofscape. So they would go and understand not only the roofscape, but maybe understand the streetscape based on by logical conclusions. And that's where AI could be really a powerful tool. It could catalyze our progress as as cities, as urban forms, as a society, or really break them. In my opinion, I wrote a long piece at the Istanbul urban I forgot what the name of the conference, but we discussed that in specific, where it says there are two main issues, and Liam Young touched on them. Liam Young is a writer about artificial intelligence and the future of humanity. Is that AI has the capacity either to revolutionize our existence or really eliminate their very existence.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer. I also received another question that relates to something that we brought up together a few minutes ago: the accessibility of geospatial data to the private sector and civil society. How do you see the future of providing such accessibility? And to quote the question I received, will SMEs and maybe NGOs be able to make use of geospatial data, and how expensive will that be if it's going to be costly? And what kind of requirements or maybe conditions will be imposed on non-state sectors when accessing such data?
The general challenge with geospatial data being privatized is it's also being monetized, and people don't want to let go of that incentive, even on the expense of the public good. Personally, I think all data should be public. I've said that from the beginning. So, for NGOs and I know my wife did work with an NGO and they had a huge issue with public data, and that's when we reached out. I was just co-founding a spin-off at MIT, Flock Tracker. It's a planning tool that collects geospatial data and reports to city. It helps cities clean their streets. We proposed that idea to help them collect data on journalists around the world. It was an NGO on journalism in the Middle East. So the challenge was there is a high privatization in parts of the world where access to these kinds of data is really profitable. And unless there is some regulation that demonetizes that kind of aspect, it's going to be really difficult to become public, in my opinion.
So it's like misusing the importance and the value behind the provision of such data. This brings me to a topic which is also rather important. I know that with developments in the fields of AI, digitalization, digital transformations, geospatial data, now that we're talking about it, comes in the word governance. And you've also mentioned that with all these practices and the misuse sometimes, or the mismanagement of geospatial data, sometimes we need regulations to monitor how the accessibility of information is being managed. how do you see governance practices are required and how to execute them?
Well, from a requirement perspective, I think there should be two efforts. One, there should be, I'll bring the example of the US. There should be a sort of a public entity effort into updating the data and legitimizing the public sector data as being the go-to gold standard of information that will delegitimize the credibility of the sort of otherwise proprietary data of the private sector. So I think it would also, the private sector can still operate on using their own data, and they can use it as a checks and balances on the credibility of the gold standard data. But having the private sector overpass or overtake the sort of the government or the public entity whose main purpose is social good is going to
Tricky.
It's going to be tricky and really can be dangerous from.
Absolutely.
It could be capitalism without regulation.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you. It's just that providing the accessibility of data to the private sector, as we said a while ago, it does improve the planning and management of resources because it paves the way to the private sector to exercise and to basically do what it's meant to be doing.
And if you think of it, data in general is money today.
Yeah,
absolutely. If we make the equivalence that 1 megabyte of data equals $10, in a private sector, the private sector will continue to race to collect as much accurate and detailed data on you as possible. And what that will lead to is inequity. It's much
centralization
like
of data versus decentralization of data.
Right.
Yes.
Agglomeration will lead to some giants in data acquisition making most of the bang of the buck. They will do whatever in their power, whatever they can in their power to protect that information and make it not accessible, make it proprietary. An example for this, just from, if you're familiar with geospatial analytics, is ArcGIS and QGIS. ArcGIS does, it's a sort of a close-ended, difficult to deal with sort of a geospatial tool. On the other hand, an open source is QGIS. I know I'm talking garbage right now. It's a lot of gibberish language, but what it is like the iPhone and the Android. The iPhone is a close-ended system. You know what you're getting. You can't do much with it. You can't customize it. On the other hand, you get the Android. The world is your oyster. You can make anything on an Android. That's really a weak metaphor to what data can, privatization of data can do.
I see. Now, this brings us to a topic which was also mentioned in a couple of questions I just received here. What are the limitations or any failures recorded or affiliated to geospatial data?
Well, geospatial data failed to predict flooding patterns in Boston. The data gave a 100-year flood pattern that happened in 10 years.
Oh.
So there are many reasons for that. It's not necessarily related to location. It's related to the quality of data. It's related to the methodology, to understanding the sort of surface runoff regulation or analysis. So that's one failure that I can remember. Another failure is COVID. If we think about COVID in the United States, we tried really hard to geospatially map where COVID spread is happening. We tried really hard to understand where the peaks are and project for them. And we thought it was going to be the tip of the iceberg, but it kept going up and it kept going up no matter what we did. So that was where geospatial data failed to give us accurate predictions into where the peak of the iceberg is.
Thank you for mentioning that, because it was one of the questions I received. How did geospatial data help in combating COVID-19? Okay, an interesting one here. Are there any ethical concerns related to the use of geospatial data?
They're no different than the ethical concerns that we have to the use of data. I would say, actually, there would be doubly more, there should be twice as much ethical responsibility in dealing with spatial data than normal data, because normal data tends to be a little bit anonymized. Geospatial data gives us much more insight. And even in the States, while
So privacy is at stake here.
it is always at stake. It is always at stake, even if our names are not mentioned, our locations are always mentioned.
Yes.
Half of the apps on our phones right now are tracking where we are. Is that an infringement on privacy? In my book, it is. They don't know who I am or what my sort of demographic makeup is or what my ethnicity is, what my income is. They don't have that information, but they know where I go, and based off of that,
Yes.
they can predict how much I make.
Absolutely. One more thing I would like to share with you while I was preparing for this session. So it was an interesting topic for me, and it came to my knowledge that geospatial data is highly relevant in the insurance industry. And it was interesting, an interesting example for me to know that some of these companies utilize open data information to know about their clients, where they live, how they go about during their day, their family demographic profile, how much they spend. And of course, they do need certain information, private information, that needs to be disclosed for them to determine the insurance policy scheme that they're going to be presenting, or basically settling as a deal with their clients. And geospatial data is one of the tools that they use to formulate and design these insurance policy schemes. So it was an interesting perspective to see how a tool that is conventionally used for urban planning and the streetscape, as you mentioned, could be also utilized in another aspect. This was just a comment from my side. Now, an interesting question.
I just want to touch on that a little bit because it reminds me of Navy Pier in DC. Navy Pier used to be sort of south of DC. It had very low insurance rates. It was in a floodplain. So, you know, it's expensive to get insurance there. The real estate market is low. But because they understood the kind of demographic that started to move there, it got, you know, regeneration programs that happened there. Intuitively, you would think the insurance rates would go one direction, but because the demographic that came, the type of sort of high earning class came there, their information wasn't disclosed. But where they commute to work, where they you know, where they end up going shopping in the weekend, or they travel on the weekend, all of that is being traced, and based on that, we can predict their income. Because we predict expenses on average, and that's all public information in the States.
Patterns of purchase and frequency of purchase, and
then you predict the area median income. Once you predict the area median income, which is called AMI, you can predict what insurance rate I can provide in this area, and that's going to yield an 80% occupancy rate. We're going to get 20% loss, but that's already covered by the 80%. It's profitable investment.
Absolutely, absolutely. CBA involved. Okay. Can you think of any type of data other than geospatial data that will be the trend in the future?
Other than geospatial data?
Yeah.
I think neural networks is the future.
Means? Translate that to English.
My brother works with neural networks, and I know very little about them. But what I know is it's really sophisticated. It's deep learning. It's sort of basically it's the artificial intelligence 2.0. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that.
Okay, no problem. This is an interesting question. Having mentioned some of the best practices or practices that you refer to, whether in the US, we've also mentioned some examples from the UAE context. We referred to India as well. Having mentioned these, are the models replicable or able to be generalized across other countries?
The method may be, but local contextuality will have a make it or break it component. So, sorry, you were going to say.
Because I was going to say, what did you have in mind while you were saying that answer? Because I could read your facial expression and I could tell that there was something that you were thinking of while saying that.
I was actually relating something that I'm doing at work currently that dealt with that I've done in the past differently, but I'm doing it here. And actually, I'm learning from my team who are opening my eyes to many different things that there is only local contextual tacit knowledge will bring that value. You know, geospatial analysis can get you somewhere, but to get to a 90% finish line, you need that tacit knowledge that I'm learning more and more, and it's very site specific. So we apply it differently in Abu Dhabi. I would say we even apply it differently in Dubai, and certainly differently in other parts of the world like Paris or Chicago or New York.
Okay, now the questions are flooding in. So in the best interest of time, I will go through them very quickly with you, but they're really interesting questions. Okay, one of them attracted my attention. Does geospatial data replace traditional statistical data? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Are Arab countries making use of geospatial data? Which countries more than others?
Somewhat. Abu Dhabi is.
Okay. Any other to mention? Worth mentioning?
In the Middle East, not to my knowledge.
Okay. What should be done to raise the awareness of the public as well as the leaders on a wide scale in the Arab world to link the content of your lecture to research and development as far as investment and raising capital is concerned?
That's a wordy question. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll summarize it. How could we raise awareness across public policymakers and leaders to take what we are discussing right now to invest or inject into their R&D sectors and investment and capital, raising capital?
Well, we can either use precedents. There are plethora of precedents in the US or in Europe. There are certainly some in Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
We can use that precedent, or we can we can discuss the potential. For example, if there are examples that are being shown here, and I'm happy to share that open source, so they can share them to their decision makers. It's difficult because my previous boss, who was, it took me a learning curve to teach my previous boss in the government dealing with public officials to explain the value of geospatial data.
Thank you for that. Now, the questions are really interesting, and they're basically moving us or swinging us from one scope to another. This is an interesting one. Does the study of geospatial data help in changing negative phenomena or wrong habits? Okay, I'll help you. Yes or no?
Somewhat.
Somewhat. Okay. So that's the social policy domain.
Yes.
All right. Unilateralism in dealing with data with the absence of awareness and not realizing the significance of muting this data. How can we overcome this phenomenon, especially in the unconscious society?
Oh, it's a
philosophical question.
You need a task force. That's difficult. There needs to be the guidelines to creating the data should be done before having the data ready.
Absolutely, yes. Another question was, which is kind of important also, how can geospatial data be protected so it is not used or misused for bad intentions by some companies? And I believe this relates to the topic of governance that we mentioned earlier and the fact that there needs to be regulations.
But they will be misused.
That's inevitable.
We can in a perfect world, we don't want them to be misused, but in the end, we all want to self-optimize as society. So data in general and geospatial data will be misused, especially by those who are literate, very literate.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm more worried about the inequitable access to those who don't know how to use it, and they're going to be the victims of not being having the exposure, the knowledge, the benefit of geospatial data.
It's a very sensitive and tricky topic, yes. Okay, how do you integrate the use of geospatial data into the development of rural areas? I believe the answer is clear-cut here, but putting into consideration the challenges encountered applying the same technology in the urban areas.
You know, rural areas, actually, I wish I could speak some of the work that we're doing now, but I'm not at liberty to do that. But I think this is an urban planning tool more than it is a geospatial analysis tool. And when it comes to rural areas, it's identifying the geospatial value that comes there is understanding what's happening there and who is living there and what they need. Once we identify the missing need, and it's going to differ from one village to another, one rural area to another. Some rural areas really like quiet life. They do not want to be connected directly to the city. And there are many examples in Abu Dhabi Emirates. Other cities would like to have a direct access to the city that is within, reasonable amount of time. They would have really they want to follow the sort of urban glamour of the capital. Others really want a secluded and quiet life. So once we identify those needs, and those needs can be, there are indicators. We build performance indicators that tell us this information. We can decide on what goes what in that rural area. But it's more of a planning question than it is actually a data question. Data is not the answer to our questions.
It's just a tool or a requirement. Yes. Yeah. Okay. We did mention a question that related to social policy. Here comes another one, but it's giving us the other side of the coin. It says, to which extent is human and social behavior at the time being integrated in the geospatial data matrix?
Oh, greatly.
I like that.
Social behavior. I don't know if I included something on that topic here, but social behavior is here's the thing. In Chicago, while we had to look at where and what demographic what is the correlation between smoking and education and mortality rate. And the conclusion of that were in certain parts of Chicago, specifically those whose demographics happen to be of African-American descent or Latinos, to have higher death rate, higher smoking, and obesity. That does not mean that this is an issue of race. This is an issue of culture and accessibility, and in my opinion, inequitable access to resources. So the way we had to do that is to identify the social trends in every sort of census tract or every region of Chicago, and see how that performed over the past. How these people migrated, moved around, went from their homes to the department store, what the purchases values of cigarette consumptions were, and then project
and the age bracket that consumes these products.
Sure. And then you can actually estimate the next 4 or 5 years through specific locations and specific demographics.
Okay, one last question. Do you see that, actually this is my question, it's not from the audience, do you see geospatial data used on a mass scale anytime soon?
To some basic geospatial data, I expect it to be used pretty generally. It's going to be a very incremental use in the near future, say give 3 to 5 years. But sophisticated geospatial data, deep learning, machine learning, anything that requires coding and understanding how to speak to a machine, that may take a bit more. And actually, I would expect the next generation, which is who is currently in grade 6 or grade 7 or grade 9, who are starting their coding programs, those are going to be our future. Those are the people who are going to be pushing the boundaries of machine learning and deep learning and neural networks.
Correct me if I'm wrong. We do need strong infrastructures, internet and database infrastructures in countries to make use of this trend coming in 3 to 5 years.
I think not having internet access is a huge
setback.
It's a huge, and I mean, if you look at places in Africa, if we talk about the banking system in Africa, informal banking.
Yes.
Most of the society in Africa, they don't have formal banks. They rely on internet access to carry on their businesses. So depriving those individuals whose main livelihoods rely on their smartphones,
yes,
is basically cutting their livelihood streams.
Yes, I agree with you. Because it also relates to other fields of work and domain and industries, which I personally relate to from a personal side.
Yeah, and in my mind, access to Internet of Things is as crucial as really having lunch on the table today.
Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. There's no more time to take any more questions. There are more questions, by the way, but there's no time. I just want to alert the audience, especially those joining us online, that certificates of attendance will be provided. And in the best interest of time as well, I would like to just give a heads up to tomorrow's session, which will be hosted by my dear colleague, Stephanie Bustani. And she's going to be talking about something which is really important, the revolution of sustainability in the private sector and moving from CSR to ESG. So I'll be personally looking forward to this session. And thank you so much for being here, whether the face-to-face audience we have and the online audience that joined us. And thank you so much, Mr. Ali, for such an insightful session. I personally learned a lot from you, and I'll be looking forward to meeting with you again and hopefully maybe collaborating with you. And for the audience, I would like to also alert them that they can register in the upcoming sessions, which will be extended all the way to the 29th of May. So the link is provided on the website, and I'll just say it out loud very quickly. It's kind of easy. It's knowledge4all.org. And thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much one more time.
Cheers. Thanks.